Good morning, everybody. I'm going to do a little video on checks and balances. This was a request that was made, and probably a pretty good one. You can usually get a pretty good understanding about what government does by the different checks and balances that are given to each of the branch of governments. Now, this is a document that's in the AP review folder in Schoology, so you can look at how each branch specifically checks another branch. We're going to go through some of them just so you kind of know. Now, there are some of these that are formally given by the Constitution, some of them that are just things that can be used in order to check the branches of government that aren't necessarily part of the Constitution. For example, like the executive branch checking the legislative branch. They can use things like executive orders, executive agreements, public opinion. Those are all not part of the Constitution. Those are things that have developed over time. Executive orders, executive agreements, past presidents, George Washington, we're looking at you, really is the one that came up with the idea of the executive order and the executive agreement, and everybody else has kind of rolled with it. But those are absolutely great checks on the legislative branch. They kind of take power away from them by executive orders, basically allowing the president to kind of create policy through just one swift stroke of the pen. Things like vetoes, obviously making war is really not something that the Constitution says, but it's something the president can do because he's the commander-in-chief of our military. So even though the legislative branch might refuse to declare war on somebody, the president can make war and they can do things that they want. Executive branch has the power to propose laws because they have access to the media in such a great amount. They can obviously go out there and try to drum up public support for certain policies. Now, presidents cannot introduce anything into Congress, introduce a potential law, but they can propose it and they can kind of try to sell it through the public. Legislative branch of government probably has the most checks. The power of impeachment, again, over all the branches of government, not just the executive branch, but really they have the check on each other. They have a check on the courts. So that's kind of a big one. The power of the purse, obviously a gigantic check on the executive branch. The idea of legislative oversight is a pretty big one. Ratifying treaties, confirming appointees, overriding vetoes are all gigantic checks that the legislative branch has on the executive branch, particularly the president. Again, politically speaking, a little embarrassing not to have your treaty ratified, to have your veto overridden. So those are things presidents really don't like to do. So it's a little bit, not only is it a check on the power, but a little bit of a slap in the face that the president's not terribly powerful or well-liked. The executive branch checking the legislative branch and the judicial branch as well. There's not as much you can do. The executive branch can just decide not to enforce a decision. We talked about this a little bit in regards to the courts. This isn't the greatest strategy to use as the executive branch. There's a little bit of a social contract that in order for government to work, everybody's has to do their job. So the executive branch not enforcing a decision would clearly be an attempt to undermine the judicial branch and really only use probably in the most drastic of situations. So it's one that they probably don't like to use a whole lot. Nominating judges obviously is a check on the judicial branch only in that it happens before the judicial branch has ever done something that the executive branch doesn't like. So I get to kind of control the judicial branch by nominating judges that I think are going to be favorable for me. But once those judges are on there, so if I nominate Seth as a judge, and Seth turns out to be not at all what I thought he was, I'm kind of stuck. Like I didn't do my homework beforehand. He's not playing ball the way I thought he would. That's a problem for me. Now, pardoning people, can't do that obviously in the Supreme Court, but pardoning people that commit federal crimes or convicted is definitely something that the executive branch can do, for sure. Legislative branch also has powers over the judicial branch in kind of similar ways. Not so much once the judicial branch makes a decision. So a lot of things like confirming judges, changing the amount of judges or justices on the Supreme Court, changing the jurisdiction of courts, changing the salaries of judges. All of those things really are more bad decision on a case, maybe with the exception of the salary thing. Doesn't really do anything for that particular case that you don't like how it was determined, but this is kind of a long-term solution for a judge that you just think isn't playing ball or court that you don't think is doing really a good job. Now, direct responses to decisions by the court that you think could be made by the legislative branch, obviously, is things like making new laws. Now, you have to be a little bit clever in the way you make new laws. If they've declared something unconstitutional, you can't just come out with a law and said, well, that is okay. So, for example, in the early 1900s, the Congress tried to declare an income tax. This was brought to court, and the judicial branch said that, the Supreme Court said that income taxes were unconstitutional. So you couldn't just make a new law that said, like, we are going to implement an income tax. That you couldn't do that. Now you could make a law that somehow got around it to gain money, but you couldn't directly say, like, we're going to do an income tax. What you could do is you could propose a new amendment, and this is exactly what they did. They proposed a new amendment saying Congress has the right to levy an income tax. It was passed in Congress. It was ratified by the states. It became our 16th Amendment to the Constitution. Now all of a sudden, Congress can tax our incomes. Thanks for that. The judicial branch doesn't do a lot of checking. Judicial review, obviously, is a check on both the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the bureaucracy, for that matter. And then, obviously, the way they interpret certain laws. So the legislative branch may have passed a law with certain language, and the judicial branch kind of interprets it and reads it a different way. Obviously, that is one of the powers they have to do that. Bureaucrats don't have again, this isn't something by the Constitution, but reality says bureaucrats can interpret the president's instructions certain ways and not enforce laws as maybe the president had intended. The bureaucracy can check the legislative branch by making budget cuts in areas that hurt congressmen. Again, not part of the Constitution, but if a part of the legislative branch, a particular congressman advocates for cutting funding for a program or a particular office, that office can make budget cuts that will hurt that particular congressman. So they can interpret and enforce laws in different ways than intended as well. So, and the legislative branch checks the bureaucracy by power of the purse, legislative oversight. Those are the big things. They can cut and add departments as they see fit. They can confirm department heads, and they can have hearings for department heads. So those are all big things. The executive branch checks the bureaucracy by a couple different ways. Appoint heads of departments, fire department heads. They can propose budget cuts. Now, obviously, they don't actually vote on the budget, but they can propose cuts for different departments. This kind of gets the ball rolling in that direction. And they can promote bureaucrats that are on the same page as the president, so they can get people that they think are more in line with their views kind of at the top of the ladder. And obviously, judicial review kind of carries out bureaucratic ways of interpreting laws, so they can say that bureaucracy is acting unconstitutionally. It's all possible. Now, there are other things that provide check and balances for government. Things that hold government accountable, like elections. We can call elections checks and balances on all congressmen and the president. So if we don't like what they're doing, that's kind of our way of checking, like a senator, like, man, I hate the way you voted on the last couple things. I'm going to vote to get you out of office next time you're up for re-election. So that acts as a absolute check. The Senate and the House, because you have to pass a bill through, to make it a law, it has to go through both the House and Senate. They act as a check on each other. So right now, currently, we have the Democrats in charge of the House of Representatives, the Republicans in charge of the Senate. So there's a little bit of a check and balance. Things might pass easily through the House that the Senate balks on and says, we really don't like that so much. Federalism is a good idea of checks and balances. Things that the federal government says, that the states want, the federal government can kind of put a stop to. So that all acts as checks and balances. This idea of a check and balance obviously is a key part of our government, because we were afraid of anybody getting too much power. Checks and balances really helps to make that a thing, so not everybody is all powerful. Hopefully this helped. If you have any other suggestions for videos, please contact me. If not, have a good day.